The second lesson in the text for today is Matthew, the 5th chapter. You have heard that it was said of those in ancient times, "You shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable of judgment." But I say to you that if you're angry with a brother or sister, you are liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you're liable to the council. And if you say, "You fool," or some other castigating remark, you will be liable to the hell of fire. So when you are offering your gift at the altar, if you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother or sister, and then come and offer your gift. This is the lesson for the day, and by the Spirit's work among us, it becomes a word from the Lord. The gospel lessons for this year are readings mostly from Matthew. There's a long series of ethical and moral instruction that's become known as the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 through 7, because Matthew puts a whole collection of teachings into one block. Jesus sat down to teach them, Matthew tells us. He is called Rabbi, teacher. I'm not sure why this thing ever got started being called a Sermon on the Mount. It was instructions to followers that were repeated in the early synagogue style of worship among the gatherings of the followers. Since these are core teachings, I thought we might use them for some basic review as we gather through an interim season. The Pharisees were a professional lay group concerned with interpreting and obeying the law of Moses. They were a powerful religious party, 6,000 or more strong. They expanded the interpretation and the application of the Mosaic law. By the time of Jesus, honor the Sabbath and keep it holy had become a prohibition against a woman looking in a mirror on the Sabbath. Why? Well, she might see a gray hair and pluck it out, and that would be work on the Sabbath. It was no laughing matter in Jewish households. Accept your righteousness, exceed the Pharisees. Jesus did not mean that they needed more little laws. Jesus takes these negative prohibitions and he transforms them into spiritual corollaries. He starts with the Ten Commandments and he says there is a greater commandment behind them. In fact, it is the great law. Jesus knew that the two tablets of the Ten Commandments were one about loving God with all your heart, and the other, commandments about loving your neighbor as yourself. The early Christian movement took these teachings to heart, and they tried to apply them to their different changing conditions and circumstances in a growing movement across cultures and generations. As followers, we are supposed to do the same thing. In lessons today, Jesus says that being angry with your brother or sister, your neighbor, is the seed that can grow into murder. And you need to do something about the anger before things get worse. Our anger itself is enough of a problem. All kinds of causes can be buried beneath anger. But we need to take responsibility for our anger. We're supposed to take the initiative to work things out before it becomes a trial for us or someone else. We need to discover productive ways to find some resolution, or at least, at a minimum, clarify the circumstances instead of letting emotion-laden supposing and imagining fester into an infection. On first reading of the text, we missed something in Jesus' statement. If you are angry with your neighbor, he says, but then he goes on to say, if you remember that your neighbor has something against you. On either side of the anger problem, we still wind up at the altar. How we relate to our neighbor and how we relate to God are two parts of the great law. They both come down to what love requires us to do about taking the initiative to restore relationships, to admit the destructive potential of anger that can be rooted in misunderstandings or mishearings or hearing too clearly, or discovering a way that someone has wronged us. What is in us that brings out the anger and the anger all around us? Families are never perfect, but sometimes whole family systems are built on anger. The political landscape promotes anger because it polarizes and helps the cause. The same goes for the rising tide of racism. It is hateful anger that raises the temperature. The heated battles of what it will cost us to reduce the temperature on earth come down to our self-centered neglect of common sense and serious science. Inhumane treatment of humans just because they are somewhere on that wide continuum of sexual individuality is rooted in fear and anger to keep sexuality a polarity and a false one. Marriages fall apart or get torn apart or just become dying embers because of flare-ups of anger. People let anger build, and it is destructive long before it gets to murder. You know, Ron and Jeannie Calgard, good friends of mine, and I'm in my visits with them in last days, would talk about the way that from the beginning they had pledged that they would never go to bed angry. Lots of couples do. So why do we let angers fester for years and years? On the other side, we hear someone has their feelings hurt or is upset with us for some unknown or known reason. We distance ourselves because it won't help to try to deal with someone when we think they are angry with us. It's best not to shake things up. Just let them settle down and it will all go away. Or they will go away. That happens often in churches, in power struggles or insider-outsider divisions. Most of the time, the anger gets buried until people can't even remember how it started. I haven't been here long enough to hear any of the sparks that these comments might have brought to your memory about this congregation. We hear someone is unhappy or hurting. We see that someone is missing. We maybe even suspect or even know what we did. But we don't reach out to listen to them in the days between our Sundays at the altar. We're afraid they are angry. So we wind up giving them another reason to be hurt. Both the angry prodigal son and the angry elder brother shared the same reason. They thought their father had not done right by them. And there he was all the time just trying to love both of his sons. Now, I don't want to suggest that any of us are Jesus. But all of us have God and people on both sides of any misunderstanding. Jesus spent most of his time with people who were dismissed or ignored or assumed to have something wrong with them. All of us just need to remember that we have a way to bring out the best in ourselves and close the distance from someone distant. We really have hope when we trust that Christ is there in the not yet of the future, leading us past anger. As followers, we're not left to ourselves deciding for ourselves what we ought to do. Self-righteousness, right living, self-right living, is an oxymoron. We have a greater standard that constitutes right living. We follow an example. Therefore, the best starting question in any conflict of any kind, especially with anger, is simple. You just ask yourself, what is the loving thing to do with all of this anger? Just asking the question changes the conversation. Love like Jesus loved is the main thing. Years ago, I had a church member who was getting along in years. He had a kind word for folks, and he had this open acceptance of just most everyone that walked in the door of the church. I missed him for a couple of weeks, and when he got back, I asked him where he had gone, and he said, "I went to visit my brother." What? I didn't even know you had a brother. I didn't for 30 years. He was a little wild growing up, and he did something that got me into real trouble. Things got worse from there, and I let my anger get the best of me. It brought out the worst in me. It had festered for so long that I decided I couldn't make it any worse if I hunted him down and talked with him. You know, I'll never forget this. Together was a lot easier for both of us than all of the years of nothing. You know, that passage in Matthew's right. So today, in the prayer confession, I can admit at the altar how stupid and bullheaded I was, and I can ask God to forgive me because I went to my brother. He's coming to town on Thanksgiving. I really hope you can meet him. We all, every one of us, has been angry about something, someone, sometime, or some else. For years, people have told me that Jesus' instructions that we find in Matthew about anger and all of those other things could really work for him because, after all, he was God. But they're just too idealistic for the real world. They won't work. And you know what my reply always is? Would we ever know if they work when we never try? So we've got a whole week between now and the next Sabbath altar. I hope you and God can do something with whatever anger it is that you might have. Amen.